Hello, I'm Larry Levitt from KFF. Welcome to the latest episode of the Health Wonk Shop, where we regularly dive into timely and complex health policy topics with experts from a variety of perspectives. There may be no more complex part of our healthcare system than drug pricing. List prices are about as meaningful as a sticker price on a car, with behind the scenes rebates hidden from public view. It's a topic that has gotten a lot of attention from President Trump, who has repeatedly suggested that drug prices in the US should be tied to the lower prices in other countries where prices are generally regulated or negotiated. While Republicans in Congress called for repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, which required drug price negotiation in Medicare, President Trump has continued to implement the law passed by Democrats. The president has also brought the art of the deal to drug pricing, announcing agreements with several drug companies for what appear to be lower prices, at least for some people. There's a new website, TrumpRx, for direct purchase of drugs, and the administration has paved the way for expanded coverage of GLP-1 drugs to treat obesity in Medicare and Medicaid. What all this will actually ultimately mean for drug prices, access, and profits for the pharmaceutical industry is still, frankly, a bit murky. But we have three national experts here to provide as much clarity as possible. Stacy Ducicina is professor of health policy and Ingram professor of cancer research at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Darius Lakdawala is chief scientific officer at USC's Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics and Quintiles Chair of Pharmaceutical Development and Regulatory Innovation at the USC Mann School. Yes, all of that. And Julia Kabansky is Deputy Director of the Program on Medicare Policy here at KFF. A little bit of housekeeping before we get to the discussion. If you have questions, submit them at any time through the Q&A button in Zoom. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Also note that this session is being recorded and an archived version should be available later today if you want to rewatch it. And we have ASL interpretation available. To access it, click on the globe icon in the Zoom control panel. Now let's jump in. Julia, let me start with you. As I mentioned, there has been this flurry of announcements on drug pricing and coverage recently from President Trump. Can you briefly run through the highlights of what he has announced?
Sure. Thanks, Larry. So I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration's general approach to drug pricing policy in the second term has been pretty unconventional. In the spring, President Trump resurrected an idea that he promoted in his first term of most favored nation pricing for drugs with an executive order that called on drug manufacturers to voluntarily make their drugs available in the US at the lower prices available in other comparable nations, aiming to, in the president's words, equalize drug pricing in the US and other countries. And as you noted, in recent months, the Trump administration has been working behind the scenes to make deals with individual drug companies to secure most favored nation pricing agreements, kind of bypassing more traditional regulatory or legislative approaches to policymaking. To date, the White House has announced 4 separate deals with Pfizer, AstraZeneca, EMD Serono, and Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. And under these deals, the manufacturers have agreed to make certain products available to state Medicaid programs at most favored nation pricing. They've agreed to introduce new medications in the US at most favored nation pricing. And they've also agreed to sell certain products directly to US consumers at discounted prices. The manufacturers are also committing to increase their investment in US manufacturing. And in return, they're receiving a 3-year reprieve from pharmaceutical tariffs. I think it's also worth highlighting some other elements, specifically of this agreement with Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, which are the leading manufacturers of GLP-1 drugs. I think most people know by now these drugs are widely used to treat diabetes, but also obesity and certain other medical conditions. Under the agreement, what limited information we know about it, both Medicare and Medicaid would have access to discounted pricing for GLP-1s. And the administration also announced plans to cover obesity drugs under Medicare, which is currently prohibited by law. So the details of this coverage expansion are pretty limited, but what's been reported is that Medicare coverage would be enabled through some type of pilot program for a subset of Medicare beneficiaries who meet specific clinical criteria in terms of both their BMI and other medical conditions. For Medicaid, states currently have authority to cover obesity drugs, but from KFF research, we know that relatively few states have opted to offer this coverage in light of budget pressures, and I think it's unknown whether the new discounted pricing will entice more states to offer coverage. Um, in tandem with these deals, the Trump administration also announced the creation of a new website branded as Trump RX, which is basically a portal to connect consumers directly to drug manufacturers and other vendors from whom they can directly purchase prescription drugs at discounted prices. This website will reportedly be operational in early 2026. And in addition to these one on one deals with manufacturers, the administration also recently announced a new drug pricing model run through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation called Generating Cost Reductions for U.S. Medicaid, or GENERIS is the acronym. Very briefly, this is a voluntary model that will offer participating state Medicaid programs access to CMS negotiated supplemental rebates that are based on what other selected countries pay for certain drugs from manufacturers who choose to participate in the model. We think this may be the first in a series of drug pricing models run through the Innovation Center. There are a couple of proposed rules that may be related to drug pricing in Medicare Part B and Medicare Part D that are currently under review at OMB. And then finally, one development that we're actually still waiting on is the release of the final negotiated prices from the second round of Medicare drug price negotiation. This round of negotiation concluded in recent weeks, and the Inflation Reduction Act, requires the final negotiated prices to be announced by November 30th. So any day now, we should see that announcement. So with all of that as the backdrop for the rest of our conversation, I'll pass it back to you, Larry.
Thanks, Juliet. So, Stacy, let's talk about these deals with drug companies and Trump RX. At least what we know about it. You know, how will this play out? I mean, how will we know if these prices are lower than what people are paying now? Who will they help? Who won't they help?
Yeah, great. Thanks. And thanks, Juliet, for such a great overview of what's been happening in drug policy. It reminds me of why I feel so tired most of the time these days. um, the products that are going to be offered under Trump RX, if I'm thinking about like who's actually going to benefit from a site like this, I think the way to consider it is if you have health insurance that does not cover a drug that you need a very specific branded drug and no other product will work for you. You have tried appealing to your health insurance plan to make sure that they won't cover it for you. That's the person who I think benefits from this cash pay site. The idea behind the site, I think, is to offer branded drugs at lower prices than what some people would be purchasing if they went to a pharmacy today and were trying to pay cash for that drug. But by and large, for people with health insurance, they really need to think about, whether or not it's a good idea to buy outside of their health insurance. So again, pretty small group of people who I think will really benefit from those cash pay prices. Another reason I'm a little bit skeptical about the benefits are that even when you have very large discounts provided for brand name drugs, they still end up with prices that are not really that affordable to the average person. So, for example, with the GLP-1s, we see that prices have recently gone from about $500 in the cash pay market. Now they're pushing towards $350 a month. And, if again, a lot of people don't have coverage for those products for weight loss in particular under their health plans, that's a great deal if you were already shelling out $500 or even $1,000 per month. But for the average person, $350 a month is still pretty unaffordable. And we know from research that, once a price goes above about $100 a month, that a lot of people stop filling their drugs at that price point. So there's a fairly narrow, like, who will benefit from that aspect. I do want to mention, like, early reporting around Trump RX suggested that some of the generic drug aggregators, so you have groups like Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drugs and GoodRx who have expressed interest in having their systems kind of tied into this Trump RX system. So if you have all of those drugs included, more people have a chance to benefit by going through Trump RX and trying to shop and find the product that's the cheapest for them. It basically will cut down. It's kind of like if you think about Amazon, if you need to go shop for something, putting a product in and seeing all the different places that will sell the same product for different prices. Like that's helpful and convenient. Um, the groups I worry the most about here are people who might have other options under their health insurance. So if you were buying through these sites through cash pay, you might actually be paying more than you would under your health insurance if the problem is that you just haven't met your deductible or you haven't reached your out of pocket maximum, and that's why the drug is so expensive to you under health insurance. So for some people, if they go and pay cash, that money is not counting towards any of those maximums. So it would require people to be pretty savvy about their insurance benefit design and think through like whether or not it's a better deal for them in the long run to go through a site like this.
And we know people are not savvy about any of those things.
Exactly.
Uh,
It's super hard even for somebody like the people on this call might have a difficult time figuring that out for ourselves, let alone people who don't spend most of their time thinking about drug prices or health insurance benefits.
Right. Darius, let me bring you in. So both Juliet and Stacy talked about GLP-1s, both the price and the coverage. So President Trump's announcement paves the way for coverage of GLP-1s for obesity in Medicare, and the lower prices may help in Medicaid as well. How do you see this playing out? I mean, is this will anyone who wants a GLP-1 for weight loss be able to get one? Will anyone covered in Medicare be able to get one? Do you think there will be spillover effects in the private insurance market?
Thanks, Larry. And Juliet and Stacy set this up very nicely for me in explaining a lot of the important details. I think this is good news. More people will get access to the drugs. It's still not perfect because the people who will get access constitute a population that's narrower than the FDA label, but maybe just a little bit of additional context that some people might not have been following. The reason that this is an issue at all is that under the language of the original Medicare statute, anti-obesity medications that are not, say, treating diabetes or heart disease are viewed as cosmetic treatments and therefore not eligible for coverage under Medicare. That's really a rather archaic prohibition, and attempts to fix that legislatively have not been successful, even though there's been legislation proposed for a number of years called the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act. So this is an important step. The work that we've done on this question suggests that there's a lot of social value and value to patients from the use of anti-obesity medications, even at the prevailing commercial prices, which Stacy mentioned, like even $400 or $500, and now we're below that level. In the long run, these are good deals for society. We estimate the rates of return on that exceed the rates of return on the S&P 500, for instance. So this is good news to expand access. The actual, and Juliet mentioned this as well, the details of this deal are still a little bit unclear, and hopefully we'll learn more in the coming, days, weeks, and months. Hopefully it won't be years before we learn the details. But we do know that there will be people who are covered by it, by this expansion that previously did not have access. there will be people who will not be covered. For instance, there's a provision, there are some provisions that are stricter than the FDA label, like, you have to have uncontrolled hypertension, for instance, was one of the clinical criteria. It's not totally clear how that's going to be implemented or defined. So we'll have to see how some of these things play out. I think in general, the way to think about this is it's a terrific step. It's definitely it's definitely good news for a lot of patients in Medicare and hopefully Medicaid too, if Medicaid takes some of this up. There's more work to be done in terms of expanding this coverage further to the edges of the FDA label. I do believe that private insurers will have incentives to be a little more generous as well, just purely for the optics. I mean, there's not clear evidence in the historical record that private insurers always follow Medicare, but Medicare coverage expansions tend to place more pressure on private insurers to cover things because it becomes harder to justify in the public imagination restrictions on coverage when Medicare is offering it. So I think that overall this is some good news um, in the pharmaceutical market, and then hopefully we'll see even better news in the coming months.
So let me just follow up. I mean, you mentioned the payoff or return on coverage of these drugs or prescribing of these drugs being high. How do you measure that, or how would you characterize that payoff or return?
Sure. So the main components are savings, healthcare cost savings from the prevention of complications. One thing that's important to note, Larry, is that there is this point that is intuitive only to economists, but not to ordinary humans, which is that it's actually much more valuable to treat people who are not as sick because those people have not yet experienced irreversible complications. So treating people earlier in the progression of overweight and obesity prevents the arrival of diabetes, complicated heart disease. That saves money. But the lion's share of the gain is the extension in life expectancy and quality of life for the patients treated. And so, health economists have spilled a lot of ink and trying to figure out how to measure those things. And so using conventional approaches to measuring gains in quality and quantity of life, as well as the healthcare cost savings, and then netting out the cost, even at 400 or 500 bucks, which is kind of what the CBO assumed, for instance, when it looked at these drugs, still gives you a healthy rate of return. We estimated it was above 13%, which, for instance, the S&P 500 is on the order of like 10% or less. Suppose it depends on the month you look at it, but in the long run, it's around 9 or 10% by comparison.
And Stacy, in terms of how this will play out in the commercial market, you agree there might be these spillover effects?
Yeah, this is one of the things I find really intriguing about the deal between Lilly and Novo and the administration. So one of the things that Lilly made public in their press statements was that the prices offered to Medicare and Medicaid will not extend to the commercial market. So I might be a little bit less sure about any positive spillovers on coverage into the commercial market. And in fact, one of the things that I worry a little bit about is that for employers, um, with the employer benefit survey from KFF, we've seen like employers talking about different ways of managing these medications for weight loss in particular. And the very public statements about, these low cash pay prices through direct sales, I think employers might use it as a reason to further exclude or to not offer the coverage specifically for weight loss. So I think there will definitely be a lot of coverage when there's a clinical indication that's typically covered under your health plan benefit. But I think that's a place where we really want to watch carefully what employers are doing, what those commercial plans are doing, because these deals, at least with that $245 price that was touted by the administration, are really not including commercial at this point. So, but I think it was a great summary, Darius.
And we have, as you said, in our conversations with employers, we have found this almost kind of contradictory messages where employers are feeling pressure to cover GLP-1s from their workforce. On the other hand, employers that have already started to cover GLP-1s are finding the cost being much higher than they expected and looking for ways to scale that back. Juliet, you've done some analysis of kind of the growth in GLP-1s in Medicare, even advance of coverage for obesity. Kind of any sense of what this might mean for Medicare costs or how that will play out?
Yeah, it's an important question. We've looked at publicly available data on Medicare Part D spending and have seen dramatic increases, just in recent years on spending on GLP-1s for the medically accepted reasons that Medicare currently covers, which obviously excludes anti-obesity medications. So just the cost of these drugs as diabetes treatments alone has put tremendous pressure on Part D plans that are offering Medicare's outpatient prescription drug benefits. So I know that, there was some mention of the fact that this coverage expansion would be cost neutral. Um, but, even at lower prices, such as were, talked about during the recent announcement, it's a little bit hard for me to see a path to cost neutral spending effects on the Part D program associated with expanded coverage. Um, I think it's worth noting, the Biden administration actually in November of 2024, I think it was, issued a proposed rule that would have, essentially modified the definition of what could be covered under Medicare in terms of, as Darius mentioned, we kind of have this outdated notion that was built into the law that authorized Medicare coverage of prescription drugs, excluding coverage of drugs used for weight loss. But I think we have a more kind of refined understanding of obesity now as a disease. And these anti-obesity medications can be really valuable in helping people, reduce other chronic conditions that they might have. So, there is, I think, widespread recognition of the value of covering these medications, but their cost has been obviously very prohibitive for many payers. And the Trump administration didn't finalize that Biden administration proposal. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether they pursue kind of a similar approach to, redefining what can be covered as far as anti-obesity medications, or, what they do through the statutory authority they have to waive certain elements of Medicare law to establish some kind of pilot program or demonstration, either through Section 402 demonstration authority or through the Innovation Center. And then I think a final question is, if they do this kind of demonstration, is it a mandatory model? Is it a voluntary model? That's a little bit of a weedy question, but I think it really matters from the perspective of if you're a plan, do you want to be the only plan that decides to step up to offer coverage? Certainly, you're going to attract a lot of people that way, but you're also going to attract a lot of additional costs. So I think these are all questions that, again, we're really looking forward to getting the answers to them from some future announcement from HHS.
And Darius, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'm not used to being the optimist in the crowd, to be honest. But I think one other good fact is that prices for these drugs have been coming down. Actually, they're already below what the CBO predicted would happen. And this is an intensely competitive space in terms of the pharmaceutical pipeline. There are a lot of products waiting in the wings that will place further downward pressure on net prices for Part D plans, commercial plans. All that is actually positive, and hopefully we'll see continued price declines, net price declines over the coming years, and that's to the benefit of patients everywhere.
So let me zoom out a little bit. Julia talked about this, most favored nation push by President Trump, and he's talked about this for quite a while. We've seen these deals with drug companies. Are our prices now the same as in other countries? Stacey, let me start with you. And how would we even know if they are?
Yeah, this one's very easy. The answer is no. um, And I think it's important to think about what products and what payers are included under some of these deals. So, for the Pfizer deal, for example, they mentioned most favored nations pricing for Medicaid, and that's where we're seeing that new model that Juliet mentioned, the generous model, is focused on Medicaid. Now, one of the things that is a little bit of a problem with starting out in Medicaid is that for a lot of branded drugs that have been around for a while, they've taken many price increases over time. And so their net price in Medicaid today might actually be lower than international prices. So there is a big question, I think, out in the research community about, is this a better deal for Medicaid programs than what they're already negotiating? Clearly, we know from many years of research that uh, our prices are higher for branded drugs than in other countries, but Medicaid has specific tools that help them keep prices in check. And again, I think we're not as confident about savings in Medicaid. Now, one of the other components is, when they introduce new products onto the market, that those products would have most favored nations pricing. And again, would be great to see additional details on how that would be operationalized. There are two key information gaps. One is that often new drugs come to the US market first, so you're not going to have a price to reference against. The other is that a lot of other countries are moving towards, like Germany, for example, had more clear net pricing information available until the last year or so, and they're moving into a space where it's going to be harder to know what their real prices are. So we can see maybe the sticker price, the list price from other countries, but they will all be pushing towards having that information on net price be unavailable to us. So if we match their sticker price, I don't think that necessarily means that they're paying any more. It just means that the price we can see might look a little bit closer to the price that, we're getting in the US. So again, not sure of the real savings. And as an academic wishing for more detailed information, I'm looking forward to seeing greater details written down about what these policies are going to look like so we can think through what real savings there might be here.
And Darius, pharmaceuticals are an international economy, an international market. How does this play out? I mean, if there are pushes for lower prices here, which may or may not be the case, as Stacy talked about. Does that lead to increased prices elsewhere? Does it lead to just changes in how pricing is structured in other countries with, behind the scenes rebates that we might not see? And how does that ultimately affect pharmaceutical industry profits, money for innovation?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Larry. A lot of this is speculative. There is some research that has been done. There are a handful of studies that have been done suggesting that this kind of MFN or reference pricing would have limited effects on U.S. prices because two kinds of compensating behaviors offset the savings. One is that, as you noted, prices could rise to some extent overseas. I'm sort of skeptical about the extent to which that'll happen for a reason I'll articulate, but that's one. The other is that you could have pullout of companies just refusing to launch overseas, so there's nothing to reference against. I'm kind of skeptical. Certainly, there'll be some drug prices that rise overseas. I mean, Britain has already signaled that they're willing to increase prices to some extent. But I think that the notion that overseas markets are going to be eager to increase prices to prevent loss of these drugs misunderstands an important dynamic in international pricing. And I think there's this view that there's all this free riding and shirking of responsibility, but I don't think that's the right interpretation. Free riding means you are getting something you know is of great value, but someone else is paying you for it, and so you're happy. I don't think that's true. If you look at the data, overseas markets are walking away from drugs even when they're being offered at prices below US prices. That to me shows they just have a lower willingness to pay. That's not free riding. It's just a difference in willingness to pay. I also think, as a somebody who's been focused on this question of how you value prescription drugs, it's just not really sensible to me to import effectively overseas countries' valuations of drugs, which is really what we're doing by adopting an MFN policy. Let's have a serious and reasoned conversation about what drugs are worth here in America, and let's develop an American system for aligning prices with value as we perceive it, rather than trying to take a shortcut, which ultimately doesn't benefit American patients and their families, in my opinion.
So Stacy, I saw you nodding. Or
Yeah, vigorously nodding. I couldn't agree more with that sentiment is that, we could do value assessments in the US to better align how much we pay for a drug based on the benefits that it provides to the population. And we don't. We don't routinely do that as a country. And I completely agree with Darius that, other countries are making these decisions. And if you can't get a price from or a price concession that gets you down to what is considered, what you're willing to pay for the value threshold you have, you're not going into that market. And so, our system is obviously not perfect. Nobody's system is perfect, but I think we could do a lot better to consider how much we value innovation. How much do we want to pay towards that innovation? We would probably still pay more than other countries just because we do value innovation. We want to be the first customers to get access to drugs when they become available. We've seen the benefits of being the highest payer by getting access to drugs first. When there are shortages, they get resolved here. When there are new vaccines, we get them first. So there are some benefits to being the highest payer. And I think we would still pay more, but I completely agree with Darius. We should do this work internally rather than try to import it from overseas.
And do we? I mean, other countries, UK has NICE. Other countries do generally have some kind of process for determining value compared to price and making coverage decisions that way. We have ICER, which is a private organization that does that. Do you, Stacey? I mean, how influential are ICER decisions? I mean, we start that process, but does it actually lead to different coverage or pricing decisions?
I think it's probably used by like the commercial market for thinking about coverage and access for products. And, these ICER doesn't evaluate every single product that is coming onto the market. Often they're focused on drugs with high prices or that affect a large population. Um, but, it seems like over time there has been more pricing that is at least somewhere within the range of like an ICER proposed price. And again, often they're providing this price range before the companies have named a price. So I think that it's used. I think that certainly when we've seen efforts in on the Hill towards moving in this direction, it's not necessarily using a specific organization like ICER. The idea is, I think, more of a centralizing those negotiations. We see a little bit of it through the Inflation Reduction Act and the drug price negotiation happening there. And again, there are some specific rules about how you do that, but yeah, I think if I were looking back at when I started my career and how the US felt about using value assessments or cost effectiveness, I didn't think we'd get here as fast as we did, and I'm older than I look. So so I think we've made a lot of progress towards understanding that this is an important activity and it's not meant to restrict access to care directly. It's meant to think about spending our money more efficiently and effectively so that we can have the things that we think are high value and we can have those be accessible to patients.
And Darius, if you were designing a system here in the U.S. rather than trying to import these value judgments in other countries, how would you structure that?
Well, I want to start with the point that Stacy made about the IRA. That I think there's a there's an opportunity with the IRA that has not yet been leveraged. That the IRA actually provides very little guidance to CMS on how to set prices. And I would argue it provides almost limitless discretion. Just says these are things you need to consider, and then you can do whatever the heck you want. You can't use QALYs or quality adjusted life years. That's clear from the legislation. But there are plenty of economic alternatives. I mean, so I've been um, in that field or in that debate about how to measure value without discriminating against people with disabilities and such using more generalized methods. But I think the way to do this is for CMS to say, we're going to do something specific, predictable, and transparent. Right now, they can set whatever price they want, which I don't think is in anybody's interest because it's hard for innovators to predict what they're going to get paid. It's not really a good signal to the private market because no one really knows, what to expect or what the price is going to be. I think having a formal, transparent, and quantitative process using, as Stacy mentioned, values that are aligned with American values is possible. And I think using generalized risk adjusted cost effectiveness would be a way to do that without running afoul of the legislation.
So we have a lot of questions from the audience, which I want to pull in, and one is about the process here. And Juliet, let me ask you about this. I mean, so those of us who have been in policy for a long time, are used to kind of the legislative and regulatory process. Congress passes laws, president signs or vetoes those laws. There are proposed regulations, comment periods. These announcements from the Trump administration have been very different. One-off deals with individual drug companies. How, a lot of executive orders, tons of executive orders. How do you see those as different from how we normally do things? How lasting are those relative to a more formal regulatory or statutory process?
Well, I think the short answer is it's very different from kind of normal order when it comes to policy making. And there are big questions about the durability of these agreements. I mean, frankly, there are big questions about the details in these agreements because there just hasn't been a lot of transparency. And I think by design, they may end up, continuing to be kind of secret agreements that we don't really know exactly what the manufacturers are agreeing to, and what they're expecting to get in return. So I think that's a concern, both from the perspective of understanding and being able to assess, the impact of these proposals, but also being able to measure their effectiveness relative to other more traditional approaches to policymaking, like with the Inflation Reduction Act and Medicare's drug price negotiation program. You can be critical of it for, if you disagree with this approach to lowering drug prices, but one thing you can't be critical of is that it's not clear how this program is being implemented, at least from the perspective of the fact that there were, lots of pages of legislation and hundreds of pages of accompanying guidance from CMS that spell out how they intend to implement the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think from the perspective of transparent policymaking, that's incredibly important. And also from the perspective of policy analyst wonky people, as I am at least, we want to understand all of those details so that we can measure the impact. And so that, entities like the Congressional Budget Office can help us understand what they're expecting the cost impact will be. And so that other organizations can assess, the level of savings that Medicare will achieve and that patients will achieve. And those details are really hard to understand if we're relying on just kind of handshake agreements that don't come attached with much more careful and deliberative procedures when it comes to implementation.
Stacey, how do you view this process?
Yeah, I think very much like Juliet. I feel the conflicting information that's coming out is also, concerning when you hear statements that are coming from the White House that say one thing about these deals and you read the press releases from the companies that say something different. And one thing I noted with one of the first deals that was made is how often they repeated the words voluntary in their press statements and their statement to their investors. And I think the other thing is the confidential aspect. So even I think within some of the models that we're seeing more details about, there are these, confidential terms that are being offered and allowing companies to change those terms more frequently than we would think is kind of a normal process. So those things all make me a little bit on edge as someone who is a big fan and loves Medicare Part D in particular. So as I think about what the effects are going to be from the program and on beneficiaries over time, those types of words make me uncomfortable for understanding that and knowing concretely what is going to happen.
I mean, we've also seen announcements of like, 300, 400, 500% decreases in prices, which are, as those of us who are pretty good at math are sort of hard to interpret. Darius, I mean, you mentioned in the discussion of kind of value assessments, and drug price negotiation under the Inflation Reduction Act, the importance of transparency. How, I mean, some of these announcements are fairly detailed, some are not. Are we getting more or less transparency through these kinds of deals and announcements?
So to me, this looks like industrial policy, which I'm not a fan of. And what I mean is government picking winners in the industry is antithetical to the operation of a market. I mean, there's no market that's really free, quote unquote, but it's antithetical to to the benefits of having a market. That's my biggest concern. And the subsidiary concern is about transparency as well, because the whole reason we want prices to be aligned with value is that we want them to be signals to innovators about what they should spend their money developing. But if they can't predict the price that'll actually get charged, then what's the use of it? It doesn't actually, from a long-term perspective. Sure, there's value in, and I don't want to dismiss it. There's value decreasing the price and increasing access today. But really, to me, the far greater issue is making sure that we are setting the right level of innovation for generations of patients to come. And you don't get that with non-transparent pricing deals because you can't predict, and if you can't predict what's gonna happen 10, 15 years down the road, it's not actually having any benefit for innovation spending. So I think that's the issue, and why I very much hope that IRA ends up being a much more transparent price setting process. I agree with Juliet's point that, against these kinds of handshake deals, the IRA looks like an open book, but still there's way more to be done in making sure that the pricing strategies they're using are transparent.
Well, I'd like to be able to predict what's going to happen 10 days from now, let alone 10 years from now. But Stacey, so we've had a ton of questions about Medicaid, which you touched on earlier. We have these deals. We've got for most favored nation pricing in Medicare. In Medicaid, we've got the generous model. I mean, you touched on the idea that Medicaid gets these rebates now, and these prices may not actually be lower than the current prices they're paying. Could you just dig into that a little bit more? I mean, how these Medicaid rebates work, what we know about the magnitude of them, and what that means for how we interpret these prices in other countries.
Sure. So, in general, for branded drugs in Medicaid, Medicaid programs get a statutory discount of 23%, roughly. They also pay no more than inflation adjusted prices over time. So if a company has had their drug on the market for a long time and they've raised their list price substantially, you end up having a situation where Medicaid gets paid back that additional price increase. And then there was a policy change a couple of years ago that basically allowed for some prices to go even negative. So if you had a product that had tremendous price increases over time, that product could theoretically be dispensed and, Medicaid paying like a penny, or sometimes theoretically even getting paid when those products were being used by people. So, as I've had colleagues who spend a lot more time thinking about Medicaid than me, they're like, you can't beat a penny or negative pricing with international prices. So, there are lots of spaces where we are worried that if you said, for example, that the most favored nations was now the new price, you could theoretically do harm to the Medicaid program in some cases if you were replacing the deal they were already getting. Again, we don't know all the details here. It seems like the way it'll be operationalized is not like that. Instead, it would be allowing for this supplemental rebate to come through and get those prices that were above a most favored nation's price down a bit. But again, we're kind of early days into these model details. I do think it's important to note that, Medicaid expansion or being, offered this lower price for covering GLP-1s for weight loss, that potentially is a lot of additional spending that Medicaid is not doing right now. And this is facing, these programs face a lot of headwinds associated with, cuts to payments, a lot of things that are going to reduce their ability to spend money or reduce their budgets moving forward. So I think Medicaid programs are going to have a lot to think about which of these models are actually going to provide benefits to them and how much, and facing that in a time where they're dealing with a lot more constraints than they have been up to now.
Thank you. Darius, we've also gotten a number of questions about GLP-1s and the payoff, which you talked about some earlier. I was wondering if you could get a little more specific in terms of what you would expect from expanded coverage of GLP-1s in terms of potentially reduced chronic conditions. Could there even be net savings to the healthcare system, or what would the magnitude of those savings be from greater use of GLP-1s?
Well, you're going to see, we think at least, and I guess I shouldn't say we think, it's based on actual research with actual numbers. Our best projection would be that you'd see more life years lived without diabetes, more life years lived without functional status limitations that prevent people from being freely mobile, being able to take care of themselves, less hypertension and heart disease. All of those things have salutary consequences for healthcare costs because now you're no longer treating all of those subsidiary conditions. Those savings are not trivial. I think that at $400 or $500, there's some groups where you might see net savings. You won't necessarily see net savings for every person for whom the drug is indicated. However, it's important to note that, at least I think based on the evidence we've seen, that it's still valuable for every patient for whom the drug is indicated. And valuable means that the health benefits plus the cost savings are worth more than the cost of the drug. As the GLP-1 prices continue to fall, then I would expect, I mean, this is just arithmetic, you'll see more and more groups where net savings will accrue, even setting aside all of the health benefits, right? And over time, I expect that to continue. It's going to account for a pretty significant amount of spending on treating these complications. I think there's no doubt about that part of it.
So we've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act some, and as I mentioned in my introduction, while Republicans in Congress have called for repeal, President Trump has been implementing it, continued to implement it. We have not yet seen the first round of negotiated prices under the Trump administration. Juliet, kind of what can we expect? When can we expect it? Which are the drugs that are part of this round of negotiation?
So the second round of negotiation that was conducted under the Trump administration over the summer was required to come to an end at the end of October. And the announcement of the negotiated prices under the law is due by November 30th. So, any day now, I think we're expecting to hear the results of that round of price negotiation. It's notable, I think, that it didn't come up in the White House announcement with Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, and why that's notable is because Ozempic or semaglutide is at the top of the list of the 15 Part D drugs that were selected for negotiation. We got that list from the Biden administration just a few days before handing the reins over to the Trump administration to actually conduct the negotiation on these drugs. There were, as I said, there were exactly 15 Part D drugs that were selected for negotiation in the second round, with about $40 billion in total Part D spending in a recent year. So, by design, we're talking about some of the highest spending drugs that Medicare Part D covers that weren't selected in the first round of negotiation last year. So those prices, and presumably the prices that were negotiated for Ozempic, will be somewhere, I think, in line with the $245 price that was just announced that Medicare would be paying under the coverage expansion in under the terms of this new deal. Um, but yeah, we're still waiting. And as you noted, I think it's important that the Trump administration is actually continuing with the Biden administration's negotiation program that came to us from the Inflation Reduction Act, because in other areas, I think the administration has kind of tried to walk away from things that the Biden administration had done. So this is an area where the design of the negotiation program kind of feeds naturally upon President Trump's tendencies to want to make deals. I mean, it's like specifically about coming to the table to negotiate lower prices. So it certainly is in the sweet spot of President Trump in terms of that you know um, affinity for deal making. But whether the administration continues to kind of double down on this program, which I know Democrats would certainly be in support of, by perhaps supporting expansion of the number of drugs that are subject to negotiation, which is certainly on the wish list, I think, of a lot of Democrats, is obviously an open question.
Yeah, and I think Democrats actually just this week are proposing expanding the number of drugs subject to negotiation. Stacey, so in the first round of negotiation, a number of the drugs had been on the market for quite a while, had substantial rebates already, but the negotiations still seemed to result in a lower net price for those drugs to Medicare. What are you looking for in this next round? Do you expect again kind of prices to be below the current net prices, kind of any differences from that first round?
Yeah, I think the biggest differences are going to be that there were more drugs where we know list prices and net prices were more similar to each other. So, cancer therapies, for example, there are more of those in this batch of selected drugs. So, I think the chances for them to generate, additional savings and real savings when we think about net spending are greater with this group of products, even if they didn't really engage very much in negotiation and just use the minimum pricing rules that are set forth in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think it would be surprising to me if they don't kind of beat the first round of negotiation when you think about like the average price reduction. Yeah, I do think there is an outstanding question about how much more aggressive they might negotiate some prices. So if the price for Ozempic is similar to the 245, or if it is the $245 announced previously, that seems to me to be a bigger reduction than just the current net price. So that does feel like they would have been very effective in that particular negotiation. So I expect it to be pretty similar. I kind of keep joking a little bit that For an administration who has become quite well known for releasing big news at 5 o'clock on a Friday, I expect the negotiated prices to come out on Thanksgiving. So we'll just, hopefully I'm wrong, but I wouldn't be super surprised about it.
I was expecting them just before we started the health wonk shop this morning, but that didn't happen. Darice, I mean, you talked about the Inflation Reduction Act providing a lot of leeway to CMS in terms of how this negotiation works. What would you like to see in terms of more transparency from them about how the negotiations or how the criteria are implemented?
Well, Larry, I think one thing as an academic that really frustrated me was CMS's statement after the first round saying, "Don't take this as any indication of how we're going to act in later rounds." I mean, it's like almost like the little glimmer of insight we might have gotten. They said, "Oh, don't view that as a glimmer of insight." I think what's needed is actually a transparent and quantitative price setting process. No price setting process is fully quantitative, to be sure, and I don't anticipate that would be the case. But there should be a clear role for economic value assessment to say this is an appropriate range of values. And then negotiation within that range would be completely reasonable. And there may be other factors that they bring to bear that are not considered in the economic approach. I think that would make this much more predictable. It would make it easier to have a discussion around how to set those value-based prices, what belongs there, what doesn't belong there. That's the kind of conversation around value that I was alluding to earlier, that if we're not going to import other countries' values, and I don't think we should, then we need to have that kind of conversation about what belongs in an American value calculation and how we're going to make it clear to innovators so that they then say, okay, well, now I know how to innovate in ways that are more valuable to American patients and their families.
And we're unfortunately coming to the end of the hour, and we have just touched the scratched the surface of these issues and have lots of questions from the audience. So we may have to do this again if you all are willing. I just want as a quick final comment from each of you, given that we have just scratched the surface, kind of what's one thing in just a few words that you would want to leave people with that we maybe haven't covered as much here. Juliet, let me start with you.
How to do that quickly? I guess, one thing I wanna say, I think the president deserves credit for continuing to kind of beat the drum of high drug prices, in this country and, raising the question about, how can we ensure that more people can afford, to, pay for prescription drugs that, bring them tremendous value and benefit. But, I think there's just a lot of questions about, exactly what people can expect to achieve and see in terms of savings from these proposals. And if if all we get are these kind of one-on-one deals with individual drug companies, it's just not the most efficient way of achieving lower prescription drug prices in this country. So I think it may be continue to be incumbent on Congress to step up and continue to move forward with policies in this area.
Stacy?
I think my advice would be that if a deal sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and you want to wait for the details or look more closely at the details. That's something that I think you can count on those of us on this call to be trying to do for you and trying to communicate back out like who will benefit, who won't benefit. But there's a lot of breaking news around this topic, and usually once you start to dig into details, what you end up with is not nearly as flashy as what it sounds like on the surface.
And Darius, you get the last word.
Well, I'll say that all of this policy has two goals. We've talked a lot about one of them, which is making sure that today's patients have access to the drugs that can make them better, and live longer and healthier lives. The other part of this, though, is ensuring that future generations of patients have a seat at the table. and ensuring that they get the right kinds of innovation. We've enjoyed so many benefits from medical innovation, and it's incumbent on all of us to make sure we can continue to do that in an affordable and effective way.
Well, thanks to all of you, and for all those journalists watching. If you don't have these three folks on speed dial, you should for any future announcements. And thanks to the audience and for all the terrific questions. And look forward to joining you next time on the Health Wonk Shop.